the thesis today is that two of the most powerful business trends in the world today are the rise of e-commerce and the rise of the Chinese consumer. And I think most people would readily accept the first, and I think the first point about the importance of e-commerce in everyday business activities is a pretty thoroughly accepted practice now. 10 years ago, maybe not so much. I think the China point is increasingly accepted, but people's ability to act on it is somewhat limited, or can be limited, because of limited familiarity with China, and it can be intimidating if you haven't done business there, you haven't worked there. So we're going to talk about how these two trends fit together and what drives them. To my mind, there are, can you hear me in the back? Because I can stick by the mic, but tell me in the back if I'm projecting. Okay, good. Then I'm going to move away from the mic. To my mind, there are two big drivers of these trends that we're going to talk about. The first is the law of large numbers, right? And oops, I have a social faux pas I need to correct. Also with me today is my colleague, Andrew Vong. Andrew's right here. Andrew is LA based, so I hope I have a chance to chat with you afterwards. I know some people have to run out. If you do have to run out, get back to me, get a hold of Andrew later, and we can keep the discussion going. Sorry, back to two big drivers of these trends. One is the law of large numbers. The law of large numbers just tells us that any good news in a system can be quite consequential if the base is large. So if we're talking about the size of China's economy, the size of its consumer spend, the size of its population, we know that any kind of penetration or success in that market is going to be quite meaningful for the business. There's a few takeaways from this chart. Clay gave us some very nice numbers up front. One takeaway, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, that tells us that last year China passed the US to become the largest e-commerce market in the world. Not only that, but it tells us China's annual growth rate in e-commerce is equal to all of the UK's. So China grows in e-commerce every single year by all of Great Britain. So quite a sizable number base. In the lower right-hand corner, we'll talk about this point a little more detail later on, but it's worth noting one of the differences between e-commerce in China, e-commerce in the US, is that the Chinese system tends to be heavily platform-based. In the US, it's heavily independent standalone sites. Although platforms play a role, platforms such as Amazon or eBay can play a role, but they're typically independent sites. And I also, before we leave this page, call your attention to the last bullet here to say e-commerce is such a driver in China, it's now become a channel for market entry. It's become a channel for driving B2B, right? When you're looking at the role it plays in overall consumer behavior, that we see increasingly brands and activity are largely defined in the e-commerce space. They're defined digitally, right? So we can say our takeaway with that last bullet is, in the US, e-commerce is still icing on the cake, but in China, e-commerce is the cake. Okay, the second driver, we just talked about the law of large numbers. The second driver is the law of convergence. The law of convergence tells us that consumers around the world tend to converge in tastes. Clay made this point in his introduction. If we hold even for income level and education, so consumers of the same background tend to behave in the same way, right? So, and this is good news, I think, for the big global brands, right? Another way of saying it is, guess what? Consumers in China tend to like the same great stuff that consumers in the United States like, but there can be less purchasing power sometimes in China or less familiarity with the brand. But no surprise that these leading global brands do well in China and they do well around the world. What's the most interesting data point on this slide? We're going to ask Mr. China here in the room, Ira Kassoff, who, but Ira's one of the great China hands. But Ira, what strikes you as the most anomalous or the most surprising point there? And if you get this wrong, I will denigrate you. In fact, I just might do this even if you get it right. I might just do it.
All such great points.
That's all right. I unfairly put you on the spot.
As usual.
I unfairly put you on the spot. No. The anomalous point here is Starbucks, right? Because we would assume that something that is food related would have a heavy cultural skew. And we'd say, boy, that's pretty impressive. I'm not, you know, it's great that Mercedes is doing well in China, but that's not surprising. It shows you Mercedes has got good acumen in marketing distribution, but it's not really a surprise to me. But that Starbucks can make a hit there and overcome what you'd say is zero kind of cultural base is pretty impressive, because there's no history of coffee in China, there's no familiarity with coffee in China, it's not part of the normal diet. As we say, all of the poems are about tea. So the fact that Starbucks was able to enter the market in just last decade and become the second biggest market in the world is pretty impressive. If we had been sent, if this whole room had been sent, we all worked for Starbucks, and Howard Schultz had sent us 15 years ago to China. He said, I'm thinking of China. Can you guys do a market survey for me and tell me what's going on? Come back to me. What would we have found? What would we have said to him? Don't go to China. We'd have said, boy, we surveyed everybody on the street. They said, I've never had coffee. I don't like coffee. I don't know anybody who likes coffee. We found no competitive brands there. We didn't find it in the supermarkets. We found zero interest or orientation toward coffee. So we would say, Mr. Schultz, our advice is don't go. And he would say to us, well, you're mistaken, because I heard Frank Lavin's presentation to USC, and it told me about the law of convergence. So I'm going to go. I'm going to make it work. So good for Starbucks. A little more, I told you before, we're going to talk about the platforms. Clay told us a second ago about Jack Malentown. Tmall is, I mean, Alibaba's the holding company, right? It has 30-some operating business units. Tmall is the B2C platform. Sometimes we use these terms interchangeably. We talk about selling on Alibaba or selling on Tmall, but they're technically distinct. They're just owned by the same group. So Tmall is the largest. No surprise, there's sort of a natural monopoly, natural stratification. JD is the second. It's huge, owned by Tencent, but Walmart is a big investor in JD. And they are both quite sizable. And then there's plenty of room for other specialty brands. I think this next chart gives a little more granularity on that. So there's natural concentration, natural stratification there, with Tmall kind of leading the pack. Taobao is, of course, the other Alibaba platform. And look, it stands to reason, right? If we think of consumer behavior, I think it's very much the same logic by which Amazon dominates the platform space in the United States. To say if you're a consumer and you've got a need, you don't want to go to 4 different platforms. You want to be able to go to one. You want to be able to compare through that one, evaluate, look at reviews and ratings, and make a decision, right? So this helps. It helps the consumer that it's a natural concentration like that. Now, but why the platform? So we're not surprised there's a concentration platform, but why is the platform itself important? This just talks a little about Tmall, but these points hold for JD and the other platforms. The real value of the platform is that it provides brand integrity or product integrity to the consumer, meaning a company can only sell on JD or on Tmall if it is the manufacturer or licensed agent. So it is not an open platform. So it is the platform itself, it's Tmall itself, Alibaba, that provides that brand integrity to the consumer. So in the United States, if you want to buy a Nike product right from Nike, you go to Nike.com. If you want to do it in China, you go to Nike.Tmall.com. And you are dealing right with Nike. You're speaking right to Nike, they're speaking right to you. These are examples of some of the brands that are on Tmall. For us at Export Now, the only brand here that is ours, the store that's ours, we do the official NFL store in China. But by the way, Tmall and JD both allow searches in English as well as in Chinese. So you can go to Tmall.com and you can find all of these sites and click around and see how robust the experience is. A little more depth on some other illustrative. Neither of these are ours, but Burberry.Tmall.com, et cetera, and talk about what they're doing in the market. Interestingly, we'll get into this a bit too. Social media is a more important driver of consumer behavior in China than paid advertising, meaning the consumer attaches greater importance to peer undertaking or group undertaking than simply corporate statements, right? And these are I think pretty strong numbers. It reminds us there that Sina Weibo is the local China variant of Twitter, and Burberry's got a nice following there, but Calvin Klein's got a good following as well. Now, we talked about the upside and market potential in China e-commerce. What are the hurdles? What are the obstacles? And we break it down to these 9 clusters of areas that companies have to think through. And by the way, just to put this in context, these are the activities that our company does at Export Now. So we provide turnkey. We'll do all 9 of these for you, or a selection from you. But the point is, the broader point is, look, if you want to work with us or do it yourself or find another third-party provider, that's certainly your decision. But these steps have to be undertaken. What you can't do is simply enter the market without having worked through solutions in all of these areas. So we'll just touch on them, and a few of these are key, and some of them are more in the commodity space. This is the goal. This is the goal of our model, what we're trying to do. We're trying to set up a transaction model in China for US or European companies so that we respect what we call the twin comfort zones. So for the Chinese consumer, the transaction takes place 100% in that person's comfort zone. It's their language, their favorite platform, their time zone, their language for CRM, their payment instrument, local currency, et cetera, and local delivery time and local delivery cost. So every functional aspect of that transaction is something that they're comfortable with, right? And we know from our own experience when we purchase things, when we go online and purchase, these attributes are so automatic, are so embedded that we expect them to be there. And indeed, when somebody tells us, hey, we're out of this product, but don't worry, you can call Germany and order directly, we find that uninviting. And it might be so uninviting, we say, look, I'm not going to buy, I'll buy an alternative product because I don't, even if they say the fellow in Germany can speak English, it's, I just have a little less confidence that this transaction is going to come out the way I want it. So we want the transaction to take place 100% in the consumer's comfort zone, but we want the client to be 100% in the client's comfort zone, because the typical US company, whether you're the SME Clay was talking about, but even quite sizable companies in the US will say, look, we don't have any China capabilities, right? We have a great product, great brand, we're in other markets, but we just don't have China capabilities. So we say, fine, we're very happy to work with you because this will allow you to execute in China and you never have to go to China. You don't have to incorporate in China, you don't have to hire anybody in China, you don't have to visit China. We can set up a virtual sales operation through the digital space where we're basically replicating your US e-commerce activity. We're adapting to the Chinese market and we're going to execute for you so you can start selling in China without putting one person on the ground. To walk through, if I've got this right, back to the 9 bullets, when we talk about getting it right or getting it wrong, to my mind, this set of discussions is the most important part of a successful China launch, successful China marketing strategy, which is to say all of the questions around what is the commercial logic of your product? Why is the Chinese consumer supposed to like your product? What do we have to adapt in terms of the SKUs, the product slate, the pricing, the themes, the messaging? What do we have to adapt, right? So let's think through the emotional content of this product, and let's think through how we're going to communicate that to the Chinese consumer. I emphasize that point because what we've seen is there are a large number of quite sizable US companies that have grown organically in the US over 50 or 100 years, and they never had to think strategically because they have a good product, it was accepted, they just kept going all year. So now they're at $3 billion in sales. They have national distribution, great national marketplace, but they've never had to really introduce themselves to a new market where people have no familiarity with them and might not fully understand the point of the product, right? So that journey has to be undertaken with a client. So we have some great brands in the US that, for example, don't do anything on social media. And they say, well, why should we, we're well known to the general public, why should we engage them in communication strategy? Well, because you're going to a new market where you don't have that familiarity. So that's number one. Two, we talked about web store design. This is another one of our clients, Harley Davidson. We do their apparel and accessories. We also started doing their bikes online. But these are mechanical attributes, but again, it's got to be localized and adapted, right? What you don't want to do is simply photocopy what's going on in the US and translate into Chinese. That might be 75% accurate, but there's going to be things you have to do to make it work with the Chinese consumer that you wouldn't necessarily do in the United States. And these are some examples here, and there's just a lot of market science that goes into this activity. And then some of the more mechanical aspects of e-commerce success that I think we're generally familiar with. But even with these, so to speak, normal set of activities, there can be differences. I just want to highlight under customer support, front-end CRM. By front-end CRM, I mean customer contact before the transaction. In the United States, this is generally pretty rare. Less than 10% of e-commerce transactions in the United States require front-end CRM, right? When we go buy things online, we usually do not have a discussion. We just find the product we want, we bought it, and we're done. In China, that number is over 90%. So the consumer wants some kind of connectivity with the brand prior to the transaction. Social media, I mentioned before that digital outreach is more important in China and the United States. Well, China has a more robust or a more complicated digital ecosystem than the United States. Social media is a more important part of people's lives, online lives, what they do. So we increasingly weight the communication campaign away from the paid advertisement and to engagement activity through social media. And then these are two absolute requirements, which is the two sides of the cross-border activity. How do we legally get the product in the country, and how do we legally get the money out of the country, right? But regulatory compliance and documentation and so forth is just a key part of activity. That we will only handle products that are legally registered, legally documented, and brought in, and that directly relates to financial settlement because you can only repatriate funds and get your foreign currency certificate if you can prove that it was legally brought in and so forth. So you need a fair amount of sophistication on both sides of these things. The good news is that both of these activities this day and age are pretty regularized, and people at USC know, depending on your metric, China will be the United States' number 2, number 3 trade partner, and in some segments it's number 1. So there's a high volume of activity that takes place in the space, and it's not that hard to do, but you better know what you're doing. A little background on us. Well, Clay gave the overview on that, and I think the next bit, some of our clients. We've got about 50 brands we do now. And if you're interested in this discussion and you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, please just note the email. Please send me a email, and it might take a few days, but I'll get back to you sometime next week, most likely with copies of the PowerPoint. If you're interested in that, I'll send it to you.